In the winter of 1834, Chesterfield County, Virginia was a place where God-fearing families opened their doors to the forgotten children of a growing nation. Orphans from the crowded cities of Richmond and Norfolk found themselves placed in homes across the rural countryside, where hard work and Christian values promised to shape them into productive citizens. The orphan train movement was just beginning to take hold across America. Charitable organizations and local churches worked tirelessly to match homeless children with families willing to provide shelter, food, and moral guidance. It was considered a noble calling, a divine mission to rescue the most vulnerable members of society from lives of poverty and desperation. Thomas and Mary Sullivan were among the most generous families in Chesterfield County. Over the course of 5 years, they had taken in 47 children. Local church records show that Reverend Michael Hayes personally delivered child after child to their doorstep, each time expressing gratitude for their endless compassion. The Sullivans asked for no payment, no government assistance. They simply opened their home, again and again, to children who had nowhere else to go. Neighbors spoke of hearing children's laughter from the property. They saw smoke rising from the chimney during cold months, indicating warmth inside. The farm appeared prosperous, the couple attended church regularly, and Thomas Sullivan was known throughout the county as a man of integrity who helped his neighbors during harvest season. But before we continue with this dark tale from Virginia's past, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Your support helps us bring these forgotten stories to light and ensures you never miss our latest historical investigations. Now, let us return to the events of March 15, 1834, when the truth about the Sullivan family would finally be revealed. The investigation began with Mrs. Abigail Porter, a 62-year-old widow living half a mile from the Sullivan farm. Mrs. Porter had been hearing unusual sounds for weeks during the coldest nights of winter. These were not the typical noises of farm life, not the lowing of cattle, the clucking of chickens, or the sound of axes splitting wood. These were different sounds that kept her awake and filled her with growing unease. Mrs. Porter had raised 7 children of her own and knew the difference between the sounds of play and the sounds of distress. She had lost her husband the previous autumn and spent long, sleepless nights sitting by her window, watching the darkness that stretched between her property and the Sullivan farm. The sounds came most frequently when the wind was still and voices carried farther across the frozen ground. They seemed to come from below the earth itself, muffled and desperate, like voices calling from the bottom of a well. When she finally gathered the courage to approach Constable James Hartwell, she struggled to find words that would not make her sound like a foolish old woman driven mad by grief and loneliness. Constable James Hartwell had known the Sullivan family for over a decade. He had attended their wedding at the local Methodist church. He had shared meals at their table during community gatherings. When Mrs. Porter approached him with her concerns, his first instinct was to dismiss them entirely. The Sullivans were pillars of the community. They had taken in more orphan children than any other family in 3 counties. Hartwell had personally witnessed Thomas Sullivan's generosity on multiple occasions. During the harsh winter of 1831, Sullivan had provided food and firewood to families whose crops had failed. He had never asked for repayment, never sought recognition for his charitable acts. The idea that such a man could be capable of harming children seemed impossible to Hartwell's mind. But Mrs. Porter was persistent. She returned to his office 3 times over the course of a week, each time providing more specific details about what she had heard. She described the timing of the sounds, always late at night when honest families would be asleep. She noted that they occurred most frequently during the coldest weather, when children should have been safely indoors. Most troubling, she claimed to have heard what sounded like digging during the early morning hours, as if someone was moving earth in the darkness. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton was the county's only physician, a woman who had earned her medical degree in Philadelphia at a time when few women were admitted to such programs. She had delivered babies, treated injuries, and witnessed both the best and worst of human nature. Dr. Thornton possessed a particularly keen eye for signs of mistreatment in children, having grown up in an abusive household herself. When Hartwell reluctantly asked her to accompany him to the Sullivan farm, she agreed immediately. She had been treating children from various families throughout the county for the past 3 years and had begun to notice disturbing patterns that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. Children who had been placed with the Sullivans would initially appear healthy when she encountered them in town or at church functions. They would be clean, properly dressed, and would speak politely when addressed by adults. But over time, these same children would begin to show signs of severe malnutrition, unexplained injuries, and behavioral changes that suggested chronic fear. When she inquired about these changes, parents and community members would explain that the children were simply adjusting to farm life, learning discipline, or recovering from the trauma of their previous circumstances. These explanations had satisfied Dr. Thornton initially, but as the pattern repeated itself with child after child, she began to suspect that something far more troubling was occurring at the Sullivan farm. The most disturbing aspect of her observations was that children who showed these signs of decline would often disappear entirely from community functions. When she asked about their whereabouts, Thomas or Mary Sullivan would explain that the child had been moved to relatives in another county, or had found work with a family farther west, or had simply run away despite their best efforts to provide a loving home. These explanations always sounded reasonable, even compassionate, but Dr. Thornton had begun to keep careful records of which children disappeared and when. By the winter of 1834, she had documented the disappearance of 31 children who had been placed with the Sullivan family over the previous 4 years. When she shared these concerns with Reverend Michael Hayes, he assured her that the Sullivans were good Christian people who would never harm a child. When she approached other community leaders, they reminded her that the Sullivans had taken in more orphans than anyone else in the county and deserved gratitude, not suspicion. The community's unwillingness to question the Sullivan family reflected the social dynamics of rural Virginia in the 1830s. Wealthy, established families enjoyed a level of trust and protection that made accusations against them difficult to pursue. The Sullivan farm encompassed over 200 acres of fertile land, making them one of the more prosperous families in the region. Their social standing provided them with a shield of respectability that few were willing to challenge. On the morning of March 15, 1834, when Constable Hartwell and Dr. Thornton arrived at the Sullivan farm, Thomas Sullivan greeted them with the same warm hospitality he had always shown. He invited both visitors inside for coffee and fresh bread, expressing concern about Mrs. Porter's mental state since her husband's death. He suggested that grief might be causing her to imagine sounds that weren't there, or perhaps she was hearing the wind through the old oak trees that surrounded both properties. Mary Sullivan appeared equally welcoming, fussing over Dr. Thornton's comfort and asking about her health during the cold winter months. The couple seemed genuinely puzzled by the complaint and eager to help resolve any misunderstanding. They offered to show Hartwell and Dr. Thornton around the entire property, claiming they had nothing to hide. When Dr. Thornton asked to see all of the children currently living on the farm, Thomas Sullivan's expression remained pleasant, but Mary Sullivan's hands briefly tightened around her coffee cup. Thomas explained that most of the children were attending to morning chores scattered across their large property. Some were feeding animals in distant barns, others were collecting eggs or hauling water from the well. He estimated that it would take some time to gather them all together, but he was happy to do so if it would put Mrs. Porter's mind at ease. Dr. Thornton insisted that she needed to examine each child individually to ensure they were all in good health. She explained that there had been reports of illness among children in neighboring counties and she wanted to make certain that no contagious diseases had spread to the Sullivan farm. This request seemed reasonable, and Thomas Sullivan readily agreed. Over the next 2 hours, 12 children were brought before Dr. Thornton for examination. Each child appeared nervous in the presence of adults, which could be explained by their traumatic backgrounds and unfamiliarity with medical examinations. However, Dr. Thornton noted specific physical signs that confirmed her worst suspicions. The children showed evidence of prolonged malnutrition despite the abundance of food visible throughout the farmhouse. Several had poorly healed fractures that had never received proper medical treatment. Most disturbing were the psychological symptoms, the way each child seemed to anticipate punishment even during gentle conversation. When Dr. Thornton asked the children simple questions about their daily routines, their meals, or their sleeping arrangements, they would glance toward Thomas or Mary Sullivan before answering, as if seeking permission to speak. This behavior was not typical of children who felt safe and cared for in their homes. The most troubling discovery came when Dr. Thornton asked to speak with Sarah, a 12-year-old girl who had been placed with the Sullivans nearly 2 years earlier. Sarah had been one of the children who disappeared from community functions, but when Dr. Thornton insisted on seeing all children on the property, Sarah was quietly brought forward. The child was severely underweight, with bruises in various stages of healing covering her arms and legs. Her hair had been roughly cut short, and her clothing hung loosely on her frail frame. But it was Sarah's eyes that revealed the true depth of her suffering. They held the hollow look of someone who had endured prolonged terror and had learned that hope was a luxury she could not afford. When Dr. Thornton attempted to examine Sarah privately, Mary Sullivan insisted on remaining present, claiming that the child became agitated when separated from family members. During the examination, Sarah remained completely silent, even when Dr. Thornton discovered evidence of systematic physical abuse. The child's back was covered with scars from what appeared to be repeated beatings with a leather strap. Her wrists showed marks consistent with being bound with rope. Most horrifying, Sarah's fingers bore signs of deliberate injury, as if someone had been breaking them individually over an extended period of time. Dr. Thornton's medical training had prepared her for many terrible sights, but nothing had prepared her for the evidence of calculated cruelty she found on Sarah's body. Every injury told a story of deliberate torture designed to cause maximum pain while avoiding death. Someone had been keeping this child alive specifically to continue inflicting suffering. When Dr. Thornton completed her examination and attempted to speak gently with Sarah, the child's only response was to whisper that she had been good and didn't deserve punishment. This single statement revealed more than any detailed testimony could have provided. Constable Hartwell observed Dr. Thornton's examination with growing horror. As a law enforcement officer in rural Virginia, he had encountered cases of child abuse before, usually involving families struggling with poverty or alcoholism. But the methodical nature of Sarah's injury suggested something far more calculated and evil. This was not abuse born of desperation or loss of control. This was systematic torture carried out by people who derived satisfaction from inflicting pain on helpless victims. When Dr. Thornton privately informed Hartwell of her findings, she also revealed her documented concerns about the 31 children who had disappeared from the Sullivan farm over the previous 4 years. She showed him her careful records, including dates when children were last seen in public and the explanations provided by the Sullivan family for their absence. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Children would be placed with the Sullivan family, would initially appear in public settings, would gradually show signs of abuse and decline, and would then disappear entirely with explanations that discouraged further inquiry. Hartwell realized that he was facing a situation unlike anything in his experience as a law enforcement officer. The evidence suggested that Thomas and Mary Sullivan had been systematically abusing and possibly murdering children for years, all while maintaining the facade of charitable caregivers. The community's trust in the family had provided them with perfect cover for their crimes. No one questioned where children went when they disappeared because everyone assumed the Sullivans were acting in the children's best interests. Dr. Thornton demanded that Hartwell obtain a warrant to search the entire Sullivan property, including areas that had been kept off-limits during their visit. She was particularly concerned about Mrs. Porter's reports of sounds coming from underground. Many Virginia farms had root cellars or storage areas built into hillsides, and Dr. Thornton suspected that the missing children might be confined in such spaces. Hartwell was reluctant to pursue such a drastic course of action based on the testimony of one traumatized child and the suspicions of a female physician who many in the community already viewed as an outsider. However, as they prepared to leave the Sullivan farm, Sarah managed to approach Dr. Thornton when the adults were distracted. The child pressed a small object into the doctor's hand and whispered a single word before quickly returning to Mary Sullivan's side. When Dr. Thornton examined the object later, she discovered it was a roughly carved wooden cross, no larger than her thumb. Scratched into the wood were the initials of multiple children, far more initials than could be accounted for by the 12 children they had seen that day. This physical evidence, combined with Sarah's obvious terror and the medical signs of systematic abuse, convinced Constable Hartwell that a full investigation was warranted. That afternoon, he rode to the county seat to request a search warrant from Judge William Crawford. Judge Crawford was initially skeptical, knowing the Sullivan family's reputation in the community. However, Dr. Thornton's detailed medical documentation and her professional standing convinced him that the situation required immediate action. The search warrant was issued that evening, authorizing Constable Hartwell to examine every structure on the Sullivan property, including any underground areas that might be used for storage or other purposes. Judge Crawford also authorized the temporary removal of all children from the property pending the completion of the investigation. This decision would prove to be one that saved lives and revealed horrors that the community of Chesterfield County would struggle to comprehend. When Constable Hartwell returned to the Sullivan farm the following morning with the search warrant and additional deputies, Thomas Sullivan's demeanor changed dramatically. The warm hospitality disappeared, replaced by cold anger and threats of legal action against anyone who dared to slander his family's good name. Mary Sullivan became hysterical, claiming that jealous neighbors were trying to destroy them because of their success and generosity. Their protests only strengthened Hartwell's determination to uncover the truth. The search of the main farmhouse revealed several disturbing elements that had been carefully hidden during the previous day's visit. In a locked room on the second floor, deputies discovered restraints built into the walls, along with instruments that appeared designed for torture rather than farming. The room contained evidence of prolonged confinement, including scratch marks on the walls where children had apparently tried to claw their way to freedom. Bloodstains on the wooden floor told stories of suffering that no child should ever endure. But the most horrific discoveries were yet to come. Following Mrs. Porter's reports of underground sounds, the search party examined every possible location where subterranean chambers might exist. Behind the main farmhouse, partially concealed by overgrown brush, they found a wooden door built into the hillside. Thomas Sullivan claimed it was simply a root cellar used for food storage, but when Constable Hartwell forced the door open, the smell that emerged made several of his deputies physically ill. The underground chamber extended far deeper into the hillside than any root cellar would require. As Hartwell and Dr. Thornton descended into the darkness with lanterns, they discovered a network of connected rooms that had been deliberately excavated and reinforced with wooden beams. The chambers were divided into small cells, each barely large enough for a child to lie down. The walls were carved with desperate messages, children's names, and pleas for help that would never be answered. In some cells, they found the remains of children who had died from starvation, exposure, and injuries that had been allowed to fester without treatment. Dr. Thornton's medical examination of the underground chambers revealed evidence of systematic torture that defied comprehension. Children had been confined in spaces too small to stand upright, forced to live in their own waste, and subjected to regular beatings that left permanent damage to their developing bones. Some had been deliberately starved while others were forced to fight each other for meager scraps of food. The Sullivans had created an elaborate system of punishment and control that kept the children in a constant state of terror while ensuring they remained alive long enough to provide ongoing entertainment for their captors. In the deepest chamber, investigators discovered the bodies of 31 children in various stages of decomposition. Some appeared to have died recently, while others had been dead for months or even years. Thornton's examination revealed that death had come from different causes: starvation, untreated injuries, exposure to cold, and in some cases, deliberate violence that suggested the children had been murdered when their suffering was no longer entertaining to their captors. The youngest victim appeared to be no more than 5 years old, while the oldest seemed to be around 14. Among the living children rescued from the underground chambers, investigators found 16 survivors in conditions so severe that several would not live through the following week despite immediate medical care. These children had been reduced to near-skeletal conditions, their growth stunted by prolonged malnutrition and their minds damaged by months or years of psychological torture. Many could no longer speak coherently, having been beaten whenever they made noise. Others had developed behavioral patterns that suggested they had been forced to participate in their own abuse or the abuse of other children as a means of survival. Sarah, the 12-year-old who had pressed the carved cross into Dr. Thornton's hand, was among the survivors found in the underground chambers. Her condition was marginally better than the others because she had been used by the Sullivans to help control and manage the younger children. They had discovered that threatening harm to the smaller children was an effective way to ensure Sarah's compliance with their demands. She had been forced to witness and sometimes participate in the torture of other children, creating psychological trauma that would affect her for the rest of her life. The investigation revealed that Thomas and Mary Sullivan had developed an elaborate routine around their abuse of the orphan children. New children would initially be treated well, fed properly, and allowed to move freely around the farmhouse. This period served multiple purposes. It allowed the children to appear healthy during community functions, it provided the Sullivans with time to identify which children were most likely to resist their authority, and it created a false sense of security that made the children's eventual confinement more psychologically devastating. After several weeks or months of apparently normal treatment, children would be told they were being moved to special quarters where they could receive individual attention and training. They would be led to the underground chambers and told that their new living arrangements were temporary punishments for misbehavior. The children were informed that their release from the chambers depended on absolute obedience and acceptance of whatever treatment the Sullivans deemed appropriate. This psychological manipulation created a system where children blamed themselves for their suffering and believed that compliance might eventually earn them freedom. The Sullivans had created detailed rules and schedules for their underground operation. Children were fed minimal amounts of food at irregular intervals, creating constant hunger that could be used as a tool for control. They were forced to remain silent except when specifically given permission to speak, with violations resulting in increasingly severe punishments. The chambers were kept deliberately cold during winter months and stifling hot during summer, adding physical discomfort to the psychological torture. Children who became ill were denied medical treatment, and several died from infections that could have been easily treated with basic care. Perhaps most horrifying was the evidence that Thomas and Mary Sullivan treated their systematic abuse as a form of entertainment. Investigators found detailed journals in which Mary Sullivan recorded the children's reactions to different forms of torture, noting which methods produced the most fear and desperation. She wrote about her experiments with starvation, describing how long different children could survive on progressively smaller amounts of food. Her entries revealed a level of calculated cruelty that suggested she derived genuine pleasure from the suffering she inflicted. Thomas Sullivan's journals focused more on the physical aspects of the abuse. He recorded detailed descriptions of beatings, noting which instruments produced different types of injuries and how long various wounds took to heal. He wrote about his methods for breaking children's resistance, describing psychological techniques designed to destroy their sense of identity and hope. His entries revealed a man who had turned child abuse into a systematic study, approaching torture with the same methodical attention he might apply to farming or any other task. The community's reaction to these discoveries was one of complete shock and denial. Many residents initially refused to believe that the Sullivan family could be capable of such evil. Thomas Sullivan had been a church elder, a man who led prayers during community gatherings and contributed generously to charitable causes. Mary Sullivan had organized food drives for struggling families and had been praised by the local minister for her Christian service. The idea that these respected community members had been operating a torture chamber on their property challenged everything the residents of Chesterfield County believed about their ability to judge character and protect their most vulnerable members. Reverend Michael Hayes, who had personally placed most of the children with the Sullivan family, was devastated by the revelations. His journals, recovered after the investigation, revealed a man struggling with overwhelming guilt and self-doubt. He had trusted the Sullivans completely, never questioning their motives or monitoring the welfare of the children after placement. His faith in their goodness had been so complete that he had ignored warning signs and dismissed concerns raised by community members who had noticed changes in the children's behavior and appearance. The legal proceedings against Thomas and Mary Sullivan began immediately after their arrest. Judge William Crawford appointed a special prosecutor to handle the case, recognizing that the crimes were unlike anything previously encountered in Virginia's legal system. The evidence was overwhelming, but the prosecution faced significant challenges in presenting testimony from traumatized children who had been conditioned to fear authority figures and blame themselves for their suffering. Sarah became the primary witness for the prosecution, despite her young age and severe psychological trauma. With the patient support of Dr. Thornton, she gradually found the courage to describe the horrors she had witnessed and experienced in the underground chambers. Her testimony revealed the full extent of the Sullivans' cruelty and provided crucial details about the deaths of specific children. She described how the Sullivans would select children for special punishment, how they would force the survivors to watch as others were tortured, and how they used the threat of death to maintain control over their victims. The trial lasted 6 weeks and drew observers from across Virginia and neighboring states. Newspapers provided detailed coverage of the proceedings, though many editors struggled with how much detail to include without sensationalizing the suffering of innocent children. The testimony revealed a level of systematic cruelty that challenged contemporary understanding of human nature and criminal behavior. Legal scholars debated whether existing laws were adequate to address crimes of such magnitude and deliberate evil. Dr. Thornton's medical testimony provided crucial scientific evidence about the systematic nature of the abuse. She explained how the children's injuries indicated prolonged torture designed to maximize suffering while avoiding immediate death. Her analysis of the underground chambers revealed that they had been specifically designed and equipped for the confinement and torture of children. The ventilation system ensured that victims would remain alive but uncomfortable, while the soundproofing prevented their cries from reaching the outside world. The physical evidence recovered from the property supported every aspect of the testimony provided by the surviving children. Investigators found instruments of torture, detailed records of abuse, and personal belongings from children who had died in the chambers. The Sullivans had kept trophies from their victims, small items like buttons, hair ribbons, or carved toys that had belonged to children before their deaths. These objects were catalogued and presented as evidence of the deliberate and premeditated nature of their crimes. Thomas and Mary Sullivan maintained their innocence throughout the trial, claiming that they were victims of a conspiracy designed to destroy their reputation and steal their property. They argued that the children were lying or had been coached to provide false testimony. They suggested that any injuries found on the children were the result of accidents or self-inflicted wounds caused by mental instability. Their defense attorney argued that the community was looking for scapegoats to explain a series of tragic accidents and disappearances that had natural explanations. However, the overwhelming physical evidence and the consistent testimony of multiple survivors made their guilt impossible to deny. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Thomas Sullivan was sentenced to death by hanging, while Mary Sullivan received a sentence of life imprisonment, reflecting the legal system's reluctance to execute women even for the most heinous crimes. The aftermath of the Sullivan case led to significant changes in how Virginia handled the placement of orphan children. New laws required regular inspections of homes where orphans were placed, mandatory medical examinations for all children in care, and criminal background investigations for potential caregivers. Dr. Thornton was appointed as the county's first child welfare inspector, a position created specifically in response to the failures that had allowed the Sullivan crimes to continue for so long. The surviving children faced long and difficult recoveries, both physical and psychological. Most suffered from permanent health problems caused by prolonged malnutrition and untreated injuries. The psychological trauma proved even more challenging to address, as many of the survivors struggled with feelings of guilt and shame about their experiences. Several children never learned to trust adult caregivers again, despite being placed in verified safe homes with families who genuinely wanted to provide love and support. Sarah, the brave girl whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, was taken in by Dr. Thornton herself. With patient care and consistent kindness, Sarah slowly began to recover from her ordeal. She learned to read and write, skills that had been denied to her during her time with the Sullivans. As an adult, she would become an advocate for child welfare reform, using her experience to identify and protect other vulnerable children. Her survival and eventual recovery provided hope that even the most severely traumatized victims could heal with proper support and care. The Sullivan farm was eventually sold to pay for the legal proceedings and to provide compensation for the surviving children. The underground chambers were filled in and sealed, but local residents reported that the property remained difficult to cultivate. Several subsequent owners abandoned their attempts to farm the land, claiming that nothing would grow properly in soil that had been tainted by such evil. The farmhouse itself was eventually demolished, and the land was converted to a memorial cemetery where the victims of the Sullivan family's crimes could be properly buried and remembered. The case of Thomas and Mary Sullivan became a turning point in American child welfare policy. Their crimes were studied by legal scholars, medical professionals, and social reformers who sought to understand how such systematic abuse could occur within a supposedly civilized community. The case highlighted the vulnerability of orphan children and the need for comprehensive oversight of their placement and care. It also demonstrated how social standing and community reputation could be used to shield criminal behavior from detection and prosecution. The story of the Sullivan family serves as a reminder that evil can wear the mask of respectability and that society's most vulnerable members require constant protection and advocacy. The 47 children who suffered at the hands of Thomas and Mary Sullivan were not anonymous statistics, they were individuals with hopes, dreams, and the same basic need for love and safety that all children deserve. Their tragedy led to reforms that protected countless other children, ensuring that their suffering was not entirely meaningless. In the end, the Sullivan case revealed uncomfortable truths about how communities can fail their most vulnerable members through willful blindness and misplaced trust. It demonstrated the importance of questioning authority, investigating concerns about child welfare, and maintaining systems of oversight that prioritize children's safety over adult convenience or reputation. The memory of these 47 young victims continues to serve as a powerful reminder of our collective responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Stopwatch equals 1S. Thank you for watching this difficult but important piece of history. If this story moved you or opened your eyes to the ongoing importance of child welfare protection, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with others who might benefit from learning about these crucial historical lessons. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these forgotten stories to light and honoring the memory of those who suffered in silence. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case and its impact on child welfare reform. We have many more compelling historical investigations coming soon, so make sure to hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. Until next time, remember that understanding our darkest history helps us build a better future for all children.